This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are interviewing the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, HaRav Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
In previous interviews, the Rav expressed the position that Haredim should be recruited into the army, and that this is totally in line with the spirit and letter of the law of Judaism. Let us suppose that everything the Rav said is correct. However, we have an army which is composed of a majority of secular Jews, and it's run by a secular government. Is this not a reason to oppose the recruitment of religious Jews, if the fear is that religious Jews would be spiritually damaged by being recruited?
This is a valid question, and we can break it down into two parts. First of all, why is it that a particular person may be negatively affected by coming into contact with people who do not live according to the Torah, do not think in Torah terms? Why should this be such a challenge, such a problem for a religious Jew who has to work with them and deal with them on a daily basis? I think the answer to that question is that it's very much like dealing with a disease. The body is able to deal with a disease when it has antibodies to that disease. That is the idea of inoculation, of receiving an injection, which introduces a small and monitored amount of a particular disease into the system so that the body's immune system learns to deal with it. Whereas a person who never came into contact with that particular disease might be cut down by coming into contact with such a disease, whereas the person who is inoculated will not. It all begins with education, in other words. If the educational system that Torah Jews offer their children is such that it cuts them off from any understanding, any contact, any experience of other types of other forms of society, of community, of life, the way other people view life, people who come from a non-Torah background. If young people are brought up without any knowledge of that, then there is in fact room for this fear and for this concern that if they were to be thrown into the army with such people, they would immediately be thrown into such confusion and be completely unable to deal with what they come face to face with. They would lose their faith in Torah. They would drop their practice of Torah and mitzvot, etc. Whereas an educational system which brings people up to be proud, strong, healthy Torah Jews, full of confidence and joy in their way of life, in their Torah-based way of life, such people will have less of a hard time dealing with other kinds of people from other backgrounds who may think and act very differently. But because they are aware of such people's existence and they know something of it, they are able to deal with it, they are able to assimilate it without it necessarily affecting them negatively. That's the general rule of thumb. That is the difference between a system, an approach which seeks to build walls around Jewish religious existence in a kind of virtual ghetto, so that the younger generation is cut off from and has no contact with anything which is not of a purely Torah nature. This is a system based on a legitimate, I would stress, a legitimate fear and concern, but it's not necessarily the most successful way to deal with the problem. At least over time, I think we will find that the approach which allows for people to grow up as healthy, balanced Torah individuals who are not made to feel they are living in a kind of virtual psychological ghetto, people who do not feel cut off from the world around them, people who therefore have to learn how to deal with the world around them. Such people in the long run are more likely to be well-adjusted, well-balanced, healthy individuals who will have less trouble dealing with different aspects of general society. Having said that, if in the particular case it is felt by the parents and the educators of a young person, more than likely one who was brought up in such a manner as we described, where the person was cut off from general society and ill-prepared to deal with it, if it is felt that such a person will very likely be negatively impacted by going to the army, then in that particular case there might be room for discussion, how to go about planning this person's future, how he should lay out his plans for his life, for his eventual studies, employment, etc. But this discussion has to be done on an individual basis, whereas the solution to the problem is not an individual one. The solution is a systemic one. It has to be looked at as an issue and a problem for all of the Jewish people to deal with, and to come up with the right modalities and the right solutions for these different problems. And I have no doubt that these things can be arranged in the army and with the army, just as these things can and will be arranged and are being arranged in general society, where more and more religious people, including people from Haredim backgrounds, are entering the workforce. Today, as we speak, this is a phenomenon which is going on in Israel. This is a phenomenon which exists overseas. In Chutz La'aretz, it's pretty much the rule that people who describe themselves as Haredi are part of the workforce, by and large, and the system works. So we have to develop a system, an educational approach, and a way of life which is not rooted in fear and secluding ourselves from reality and hiding ourselves from the real challenges. The solution lies in delineating an approach, an educational approach and a way of life which faces the issues head-on in an intelligent and honest manner.
Is the Rav suggesting that it would be better for Jews to mix themselves within secular communities and live among them as well, as opposed to creating religious neighborhoods and communities?
I do not believe that the Torah directs us explicitly how we should run our lives in that fashion, down to that resolution. In other words, for some people it's possible and even perhaps desirable for different reasons to live in a neighborhood or in an area or in a town where there are all kinds of people, all kinds of Jews. I just spent this past Shabbat in Netanya, for example. And it's certainly not the case that in that part of the city in which we stayed, it's not the fact that all the Jews in that neighborhood are religious, and yet there are many shuls and many religious Jews, and people are quite able to live in that environment. And this is also the case for many Jews overseas in Chutz La'aretz. They have to live within a non-Jewish country. They have to live in an area which, even if it's a majority of the residents of that neighborhood perhaps are Jewish, there are certainly non-Jews in the vicinity. There are all kinds of non-Torah, shall we say, or very un-Jewish practices and people that you have to come into quite close contact with on a daily basis. And yet Jews find it possible to live in such circumstances. It's also possible to live in a more concentrated kind of neighborhood where the vast majority of the inhabitants are of one stripe, or whether it's a neighborhood or a town or a yishuv, a settlement, moshav, a kibbutz, whatever it might be. That is also a possibility. Many Jews opt for that possibility, and this, to a large extent, is a matter of personal choice, and sometimes a matter of no choice at all. The choice, so to speak, is forced upon the person due to certain circumstances. So we can't lay down any clear guidelines as to where Jews should or should not live. It all depends on the availability of the proper and necessary Jewish communal services, such as a Beit Knesset, a synagogue, and a school, schooling for the children, etc.
Thank you, HaRav Bar-Hayim. A word to our viewers. If you would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with HaRav Bar-Hayim in honor or memory of a loved one, or if you would like to order a Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.